Okay, welcome back to Apologetics. This is our class outline, so we can kind of see where we're at. We're down to the last section. I've been calling it section C, or the third section. So we'll zoom in here, and it's hard to believe, but we've made it to lecture number 13. So last week we talked about good reasons to believe that the Bible is from God, and now we're asking the questions, well, what books should be in that Bible? Of course, we understand, or most Christians would see the 66 books of the Bible as the ones that belong in the Bible, but we need to ask the question in this class, and when we're making a case for Christianity, why those 66? Why are those 66 in the Bible and not others? Well, remember what we're claiming that the Bible is. As we're presenting this case for Christianity, if we're trying to, from ground zero, provide good reasons and evidence to believe that Christianity is true, then remember what Christianity or Christians say about the Bible. According to Christianity, the Bible just is a collection of messages from God. According to Christianity, that's what the Bible is. We use the word Bible to refer to that collection of 66 books, and according to Christians, those are messages from God. So, another way to ask this question, or another way to get at this issue, is simply to ask, which books really are messages from God? If a book or a letter really is a message from God, then it belongs in the Bible, because that's what the Bible is supposed to be, a collection of messages from God. And if it's not a message from God, then it doesn't belong in the Bible. So really, the better question is, how do we know what really is a message from God and what isn't? That's the question that we're getting at when we ask this question, what books belong in the Bible? We're really asking, how do we know which messages or which books are really from God, messages from God? As you know, and we've discussed many times in this class, you can answer that question with one word. How do we know what messages are really from God? The one-word answer to that, of course, is miracles. The purpose of miracles is to authenticate that something really is from God, because only God can perform a miracle or give somebody the ability to do miracles. It performs the functions we've talked about many times of a wax seal that was used in ancient times by a king. Only the king had that seal. It was very unique. And so if you got a message with that seal on it, then that would give you good reason to believe the message really was from the king. And that is the purpose of miracles. They serve that function to give us evidence a message really is from God. Some people think, maybe people who aren't very familiar with the Bible, they think that the Bible is just full of miracle stories. And that's actually not the case. If you kind of lay it out mathematically, the Bible, the 66 books of the Bible, were written over a period of 1,500 years. So think about that for just a moment. 1,500 years period during which these 66 books were written. And within those 66 books, there are approximately 250 miracles recorded. So if you do the math, it would be, on average, a miracle every 6 years. So it doesn't record just miracles happening all the time. I mean, those are the most famous stories of the Bible, of course, because those are the ones we tell our children and talk about at church a lot. But really, one every 6 years, that's not very common. In addition, that's not the regular occurrence that we see, one every 6 years. In fact, there's really only about 3 time periods within that 1,500-year period where miracles took place. So according to these 66 books, sometimes there would be hundreds and hundreds of years that would go by and there would be no miracles. So within that 1500-year period, there were 3 unique time periods where a lot of miracles took place. But then many hundreds of years would go by before the next period where a lot of miracles would take place. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, what's unique about those 3 specific time periods where there were a bunch of miracles? Well, it was during those 3, in general, time periods that the Bible was written. And so miracles were performed by those who were claiming to have a message from God to authenticate they really had. So those 3 periods I'm talking about, if you just think with me for a moment, these 3 time periods, the first one is the time of Moses, and obviously Moses' miracles, the plagues in Egypt, the parting in the Red Sea, famous Bible stories. So you've got that era, right? And that's when the Bible first began to be written, Moses and then some of his successors. So a lot of miracles were being performed to authenticate that first part, if you will, the first third of the Bible. Later on in the Old Testament, there's a time period, sometimes it's called the time of the prophets. So think of Elijah, Elisha kind of kicking off this time period. So during the time of the prophets, there were and this is hundreds of years later, there were also many miracles performed for the same reason, to authenticate these prophets and everything that they were writing that they were true prophets, that they really had messages from God. And then, of course, the third era where a lot of miracles take place is during the time of Jesus and his disciples. And that's what we would understand when the New Testament, the third section of the Bible, if you will, was written. And so miracles were necessary at that point to authenticate Jesus and his disciples as they gave us new messages from God. But after that was completed during the first century, it seems for the most part that miracles have died out. And people aren't performing miracles today, and really haven't over the last, 1900 years. Why? Because there hasn't been any new revelation from God. There hasn't been any new messages from God, so there wasn't a need for miracles, if you will. Now, some people at this point will often balk at me or balk at this idea that there hasn't been any miracles for 1900 years. But what I mean by that, remember how we defined miracle. We defined it very specifically, and I think the Bible defines it this way as well, as something that a person performs in order to authenticate that they really have a message from God, an act of God that only God could give somebody to do to authenticate a message really is from him. Does God still work in the world today? Of course he does. Has he done things, even supernatural things, over the last 1900 years? Of course he has. So somebody might say, well, my cousin was healed, and God did that. And that might be the case. God might have used things providentially, medicine and doctors. God works in those ways too. But I would say that God works supernaturally today as well. But that's different than God using somebody to do a miracle to authenticate new revelation. Those are the miracles that I'm talking about that hasn't happened for the last 1900 years. And you can even see that in the New Testament. When you get towards some of the books of the New Testament that were written later in the first century, you can see that the apostles' ability to do miracles was dying out. So Paul was, instead of healing his friends, he was giving them medical advice because his ability to heal and do these wonderful miracles was dying out. The need for them was disappearing because God wasn't giving any new revelation. So you see, some people would say, like in the mid to late 60s in the first century, you start to see miracles, the apostles not being able to do miracles anymore. I'm not saying that God can't do miracles. We don't want to put God in a box. God can do anything, right? He's omniscient or omnipotent. But that doesn't mean he has to always do miracles in the same way all the time. And in fact, what it looks like is that he doesn't. He only gives people the ability to do miracles when he's giving new revelation. At least that's what we see in the Bible. Well, to continue on our topic for tonight then, how do we know then what books really are messages from God? We're going to start with the New Testament. And as you'll see tonight, I'm not going to just dump a bunch of facts on you. I don't think that's helpful, plus it's often boring just to go through a bunch of details and names and dates and facts. Instead, what I want to provide you with is an argument for why a certain book or letter should be considered a message from God or not. So what I want to give you is the argument, and make sure you understand how the argument flows and how it works, so that you know what facts are important. It's one thing we could take all 27 books and say, who wrote them, what's the historical evidence for when they were written and who wrote them, and that's, a lot of work, and, we have to do that within Christianity, of course. But tonight, for this class, for this lecture, I don't want to go through all those details. I want to give you the argument because I think the argument tells you what's important to look at. And once you understand the argument, then you'll know what details and facts are the most pertinent to research. Okay? So, let's start out with an argument for the 27 books of the New Testament. Here's an argument. We'll just walk through it slowly. It's a rather long argument because I wanted to include all the premises. But this argument that I'm going to present for you now is an argument that these 27 books, which we call the New Testament, really are messages from God. So, first premise, not surprisingly, is that God exists. And I put this in here to once again emphasize how important it is, the order that we're going through this. Because if there is no God, obviously there can't be any messages from God. So the importance of establishing the existence of God before we go through the rest of this argument is important. I think premise 2 needs to be included, that God sometimes communicates to humanity through people. We call these people, the term we use for that is prophets. Okay? And they were both male and female prophets. Premise 3, therefore, some people truly have messages from God. And that would just follow from premise 2. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. I think we want to remind ourselves of premise 4, and that is that there are people who claim to have messages from God, but they really don't. Sometimes they're called false prophets. They might be purposefully deceiving people, or they themselves might just be deceived. They might be mistaken. They might think they have a message from God, but they really don't. So there's two types of false prophets. Those that are lying and those that are just mistaken. So how do we know the difference? How do we know if somebody is a true prophet or a false prophet? And that is the miracle test that we've been discussing for several weeks now. The importance of miracles and the role that they play. Number 6 then, there's good solid historical evidence that the apostles, and I trust you understand the word apostle is just used interchangeably with the word Jesus' disciples. For the most part, the apostles were just Jesus' disciples. Okay? So there's good historical evidence that Jesus' disciples claimed to have messages from God and performed miracles to back up their claim to have messages from God. And we've looked at a lot of this historical evidence. When we went through the historical reliability of the New Testament, we did all of that work to back up premise 6. Therefore, premise 7, a bit of a conclusion here, the New Testament should include that the books that the apostles said were messages from God. Now this is a critical premise, and this will help us a lot through this lecture tonight. when we remember, okay, what book should go in the New Testament? Well, what books are really messages from God? Well, the apostles are the ones who had the knowledge and the ability to say what were really messages from God or not. So, how do we know if a book goes in the New Testament? How do we know a book should be in the Bible? Well, it's if the apostles said it was really a message from God or not. This apostolic authority, sometimes it's called, isn't really as much of an authority as it is just that they were in the position to know, as prophets, what was really messages from God and what wasn't. So this behooves us then, premise 8, to do historical research and figure out which books the apostles said were messages from God. Okay, this just takes some historical investigation to ascertain what books the apostles either wrote or approved and claimed that they were messages from God. Premise 9, the early church or the early Christians did this historical research, and they concluded that it was these 27 books that were affirmed by the apostles to be messages from God. That is how we arrived at this list of 27, if you will. Now sometimes, and we'll talk about this later, but sometimes people like to come up with conspiracy theories about the early church and some of these early church councils and how they were really just trying to protect male leadership, or there were political maneuverings going on, and that's how they decided on the 27. But if you look at the writings, if you look at these early church councils, and as they were explaining what they were doing, they were, according to them, they said that they were doing historical investigation, historical research to try to discover which books were really approved or affirmed by the apostles and which weren't. Of course, we can always attack somebody's motives. We can come up with ulterior motive theories, conspiracy theories, possibilities. Well, maybe they really picked these 27 for a different reason, for political power or male power over women or something like that. But whenever somebody brings up those possibilities, I always ask, do you have any historical evidence for your theory? Do you have any, maybe a diary or something from these early church councils where they're saying, yeah, we really picked these 27 because X, Y, Z? Otherwise, you're grasping at straws. When you're speculating about people's motives, that's, well, it's a logical fallacy called the ad hominem logical fallacy. You're attacking the person instead of their argument. So according to them, face value, they said they were trying to do research to determine what books were really approved by the apostles as messages from God or not. The good thing is, even if we don't trust these councils, let's say we, for whatever reason, think that they had ulterior motives, we can just scratch, right, their research and do our own. We can do the exact same historical investigation that they did and try to ascertain through the historical method what books were really affirmed by the apostles and which weren't. Now, it's a bit more difficult for us than the early church councils, of course, because they were closer in time, in history, to the events, right? But we can do that same sort of historical investigation. And in fact, people do. I want to give you two resources. If this is something that you're interested in, this would be a good place to start, just a basic textbook. You'll have to dive more deeper than just a basic textbook, but this will get you started. And then through the footnotes and the bibliography of this, you can really, really dive into the modern research that's done to try to answer this question. So the first one here, An Introduction to the New Testament by D.A. Carson and Douglas Moo. I want to tell you a little bit about the authors. For instance, Carson got his PhD from the University of Cambridge, one of the top universities in the world, and Moo got his PhD from the University of St. Andrews. So you can't hardly ask for higher academic credentials, right? And this would be a good place to get started about doing that historical research, who wrote the books of the New Testament, what's the historical evidence for that, so on and so forth. So the facts, the details that we're not going to cover as much in this lecture can be found in resources like this. If you're looking to write maybe your paper for the class on this topic. Another resource I'll share with you is a book, textbook again, The Cradle, the Cross, and the Crown, an introduction to the New Testament. This is written by 3 authors, Andreas Kostenberger, L. Scott Kellum, and Charles Quarles. And these guys, I had the privilege of studying under them. They were, all 3 of them, professors at my seminary. I'll tell you a little bit about their background. So I'll just tell you about Kostenberger. So Kostenberger is very highly regarded in the scholarly world by Christians, non-Christians, all around. Very highly respected, world-renowned scholar. And he specifically focuses on the Gospel of John. Now, this is just an introductory New Testament book, so it covers all 27 books. You know, the historical evidence for who wrote them, dating them, all that stuff, the history buffs, those type of facts, if you would like, is in here. And then the bibliography and the footnotes would have many, many more scholarly resources, but this would be a good place to start. Good, solid, academically respected scholarship. And these are evangelical scholars. So we can conclude this argument, a lot of premises here, but I trust you can see their importance. But we can conclude that then these 27 books are messages from God. And if the New Testament is simply supposed to be a collection of messages from God, then there's good evidence that these 27 books then are in fact messages from God and therefore should be in the New Testament or the Bible. Sometimes you might hear the term the New Testament canon, not the gun, shooting a cannonball, but it's spelled a bit differently, but it's pronounced the same, canon. The New Testament canon is just these 27 books. Now let's talk a little bit more about these church councils, because again, there's a lot of conspiracy theories out there, and you might have even come across some ideas like this that, it was these later councils, these early church councils that decided what books go into the Bible. Well, is that accurate? Yes and no. Let's walk through the details about these councils. Some people claim that, the canon, the New Testament canon, was determined centuries later, centuries after the New Testament was written, by politically motivated meetings. What I'm referring to here is the Council of Nicaea in AD 325 and the Synod of Hippo in AD 393. So the idea that it was these councils that determined what goes into the Bible, the New Testament, because of political motivations is just a misunderstanding. From the very beginning, the early Christian movement, all the early Christians, including these councils, understood that only the books the apostles affirmed were messages from God should be in the New Testament. As I mentioned, sometimes this is called apostolic authority. And when I say affirmed by the apostles, I use that term instead of authored because not all of the books that the apostles affirmed were messages from God were written by apostles. For example, we've talked a lot about the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts, written by Luke, who wasn't an apostle. So it's not as though these books had to be written by an apostle. They had to be affirmed by an apostle, or the apostles, as being real, true messages from God. As we talked about, sometimes the way that inspiration worked is that somebody would record what the prophet said and did, and then the prophet would affirm what was written and say, yes, that's exactly what I said and did, and that is the correct message from God that God gave me. And Luke was one of those individuals where he wasn't a prophet or an apostle himself, but he recorded what the apostles and prophets did, and then the apostles said, yes, this is accurate, this is correct, these are the right, true messages from God. So the apostolic seal of approval, so to speak, is what authenticated a book as really being a message from God, not necessarily having to be written by an apostle. You can see, even in the New Testament, how early Christians, very, very early in the church, in the first century, this was understood, that the apostolic role, the role of an apostle, was to authenticate what was really from God or not. And they did this authentication through miracles. So, for example, to be an apostle, you had to be able to perform miracles. Look at what Paul wrote in 2 Corinthians 12. He said, "The distinguishing marks of a true apostle were performed among you with all perseverance, signs, wonders, and miracles." Different terms referring to the same thing, only things that God can do or accomplish, right? And this makes sense that an apostle had to be able to perform these signs because that was their task, to affirm what was really from God or not. So, for example, in the book of Acts, there's approximately 35 miracles in the book of Acts, and the vast majority of them are done by the apostles because that was their purpose. Interestingly enough, another qualification to be an apostle was that you had to have seen Jesus' risen, glorified body. And I'm pulling this from Acts chapter 1 and 1 Corinthians 9. And that's another reason why there can't be apostles today, I guess, unless somebody could do miracles and has seen the risen Jesus. Those two qualifications, according to the New Testament, have to be met in order to be a true apostle. Well, going back to these councils then, if the councils didn't decide what books go in the Bible, if that was determined by the apostles, then what was the purpose of these councils? What was their function? The councils didn't determine what books were really from God or not. The apostles determined that. So what were these councils for? Well, by the time you get to the Council of Nicaea, by the time you get to the 4th century, the Council of Nicaea was AD 325. By the time you get to that place in history, there were several books floating around that claimed to have either been written by an apostle or approved by an apostle, but really weren't. In other words, Pseudepigrapha was popping up. Fakes, false prophet books were popping up. Now it makes sense that these Pseudepigrapha, these fake books, would claim to have been written by an apostle because the early church knew the early church would only accept something as from God if it was approved by an apostle. So it would make sense if you're trying to trick somebody in the early church to believe that your message really was from God. If you would just have this message from God and it was written by Adam Johnson, the early church would be like, well, who's that? He hasn't done any miracles. We're not going to believe that's really from God. But if I take what I wrote and I say, well, actually this was written by the Apostle Peter, well, now I've got people's attention because everybody knows the Apostle Peter and he had the authority as an apostle to say what was really from God or not. And so people using that strategy, a lot of these fake books, fake epistles, fake gospels were popping up. And the councils were organized to do basically what we would say today, historical research. These councils got together and said from all corners of the earth, so to speak, and say, okay, well, what evidence do you have that that really is from an apostle? What evidence do you have that an apostle really approved that? Let's get all these together and do some historical research. And that was the purpose of these councils. They used historical methods, similar to what we would use today, to try to ascertain what books were really approved affirmed by the apostles or not. As I said, they had one advantage over us, in that they were closer in time to the first century. So their historical investigation was a little bit easier. Sometimes people will ask, well, why didn't they have these councils earlier? Why did they wait till AD 325? Well, for one reason, Christianity was illegal till 313. So you couldn't really call a council together, right? You couldn't do a public meeting where you're going to do all this investigation, historical work, gather everybody together from four corners of the earth and have this big conference, hundreds of people, because it was illegal to do so. But shortly after Christianity became legal, the first council was called for, 325. Another reason why they didn't have these councils earlier is that there was fairly standard agreement as to what was approved or affirmed by the apostles and what wasn't. Not for all 27 books, but for the vast majority of them, there was pretty standard agreement. And that would make sense. The closer you go back in time, the more easier you would be able to verify that. We used the example before of George Bush versus George Washington. If somebody claimed to have found a letter written by George Washington, we'd have to investigate that for a while to see if it was authentic or not. But if somebody, claimed, oh, I found a letter written by George Bush, we could authenticate that a lot easier. Well, we could just go ask George Bush, did you write this? So on and so forth. Is there any other evidence, any eyewitnesses who saw him write it? It'd be easier to figure it out. Maybe not with 100% certainty, obviously not with 100% certainty, but easier than figuring out if George Washington really wrote a letter that we discovered. So same thing, first century, second century, even into the third century, not as much worry or uncertainty because you could just ask, oh, you knew Peter, what did he say about these? Or you studied under the Apostle John, what did John say? And so you could just verify. But you get 200-300 years later, and then a lot of the generations have passed on, of course, and you've got multiple generations, and so you start having to do this historical investigation. So it just makes practical sense. Plus, at this time, there were many, many fake books being circulated. And with now Christianity being legal, you can imagine that a lot of fake propaganda, a lot of fake books claiming to be affirmed by the apostles were popping up, right? So now, you had to deal with this. Okay, how do we know this really isn't from the apostles? How do we know this really is from the apostles? Let's just put them all out on the table and start doing, investigation, historical investigation of all of them. Some of the New Testament books that were being questioned by that time were books like Philemon, 3 John, and James. So even some of what we consider the 27 New Testament books, there was some doubt. There were starting to be, because these three in particular don't have as much historical evidence as some of the other New Testament books, and so people were starting to wonder, because there were so many fakes, how do we know these aren't fakes? So some were questioning these three books in particular, Philemon, 3 John, and James. Well, why then did the councils conclude, both at Nicaea and Hippo, why did they conclude that these 27 were affirmed by the apostles? Well, it was because of historical evidence. It was because of their investigative work and digging into it and looking at the evidence. And the best evidence for them and for us today is that these 27 books are the ones, and only the ones that we know of, that the apostles in the first century affirmed were truly messages from God. And we can look at some of these specific investigative rabbit trails that they went on. And again, these two textbooks that I mentioned would be where you'd get more of these details, but again, I'm trying to explain to you which details are pertinent, so then you can do that sort of research. Because don't take my word for it. Just like we don't take necessarily the word of the councils. We investigate ourselves and look at the best evidence. So I'll give you some of these examples. 25 of the 27 New Testament books were quoted by early church members as being affirmed by the apostles by AD 110. So just track with that for a second. By the year 110, you've got 25 of the 27 books that are being quoted by early church leaders as affirmed by the apostles. So that was some good historical evidence. Another example here, this is kind of just a genealogy of discipleship, so to speak. So you're familiar with the Apostle John. He wrote the Gospel of John, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John. You know about John. Well, John discipled a gentleman by the name of Polycarp. Polycarp lived from 69 to 155, and Polycarp discipled somebody by the name of Irenaeus, who lived from 130 to 202. So you can kind of see the if you will, heredity of discipleship. Irenaeus to Polycarp to the Apostle John. And between Polycarp and Irenaeus, between those two, they quote 23 of the 27 New Testament books as being affirmed by the apostles. So there's a historical trail back to the Apostle John of which books were really affirmed by the apostles and which weren't. Irenaeus, by the way, affirms the authorship of all four of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So there's a historical train you can follow. Another example we know from the historian Eusebius, who lived in the 3rd and 4th centuries, AD 265 to 339, we know from him that a gentleman, Papias, who lived from 60 to 125, we know that Papias confirmed the authorship of Matthew and Mark. And it would be very unlikely to invent the idea of a gospel, a true message from God being written by somebody like Mark. Because Mark wasn't an apostle. So if you're going to lie, if you're going to try to convince people that something that you wrote was really written by an apostle, you would say something like it was written by John or it was written by Peter. You wouldn't say it was written by this guy Mark. So that's an unlikely lie. But still, you want to look at the historical evidence that it was really not necessarily written by Mark, because that's not the important thing. The important thing is that it was affirmed by the apostles. So that's the evidence that we need to look at. Affirming, the apostles affirming a book is from God is the key. As I said, that's more important than who wrote it. So let's say the early church or these early councils made a mistake. Mark didn't really write the Gospel of Mark. Barnabas wrote it. That's really not that big of a deal, because who wrote it isn't as important as whether or not the apostles affirmed it was a message from God or not. That's one of the reasons why we're not too concerned that we're unsure who wrote the book of Hebrews, for example. You might know in the New Testament, the book of Hebrews, there's a lot of uncertainty as to who wrote that. But at the end of the day, who wrote Hebrews isn't as pertinent as whether it was affirmed by the apostles as a message from God or not. So you can spend, again, my point is you can spend all this time and effort trying to nail down facts, who wrote Hebrews, that really aren't as pertinent. The facts that are more pertinent is, did the apostles affirm Hebrews was a message from God or not? So based on the historical evidence, both Nicaea and Hippo, these councils, agreed that these 27 books were affirmed by the apostles. The major New Testament books were unquestioned. When I say the major books, I mean the Gospels and most of Paul's letters. There were some, and there are some New Testament books that don't have as much historical evidence that they were affirmed by the apostles. But all 27 have fairly good evidence. Some just have more than others. Let's talk about some of these fakes that were floating around. Okay? And you might have heard of these as well, like the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Judas, the Gospel of Peter. There's a lot of these pseudepigrapha. But let's look at three of the most famous ones and see why both these early church councils rejected them as being approved by the apostles, and why modern scholars also agree that they were not written or approved by first century apostles. So let's start with the Gospel of Thomas. So the Gospel of Thomas, there was a lot of excitement sparked when a complete version of the Gospel of Thomas was found in 1945. Now the Gospel of Thomas doesn't include a narrative, so doesn't describe the things that Jesus did. It's just a collection of 114 supposed sayings of Jesus. So it's a book of sayings or a book of teachings. Now 2/3 of these sayings are found in the 4 canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. 1/3 of these sayings are not. So a lot of excitement then was about the 1/3 of these sayings that aren't found in the canonical Gospels, of course. But these 1/3 of sayings that aren't found in the canonical Gospels, they're clearly, and everybody acknowledges this, from the Gnostic religion. You might know a little bit about Gnosticism, but basically it was an early competitor to Christianity. So just like today, in the ancient world, there were many different religions, new ones popping up all the time, and Gnosticism became a rather popular religion that competed, if you will, with Christianity. And it's very clear, you read these other sayings, and everybody agrees that they come from this alternative religion, this Gnostic religion. And it's very common, even religions that pop up nowadays, they like to get Jesus on their side, right? They like to claim Jesus is for them, or Jesus would approve what they're saying. And this was happening very early, right? So these Gnostic religions would try to put their teachings in the mouths of Jesus, so to speak, but it was a forgery. In fact, some of the early researchers within Christianity, the early church researchers that were trying to determine what books were really from the apostles and which weren't, they, through their historical investigative work, discovered that these were forgeries. Okay, so Origen, Eusebius said, and we have the work of Origen and Eusebius, where they said, no, these are forgeries. We know that they're not really Jesus' sayings. And modern scholars agree that this really wasn't written by the Apostle Thomas. Okay. Let's move on to the next one, the Gospel of Peter. We've got record of early Christian investigators looking into this and recording that it was a forgery. Now, a lot of these forgeries, we've only known down through history, we've only known them by name, because these early church investigators, or researchers, I keep calling them, these people in the early church that were trying to figure out with historical investigation what books were really affirmed by the apostles and which weren't, after they would do their research, they would make lists. And we have those lists passed down to us even today from these early church researchers. They would say, yeah, no, this is a list of fakes. These are a list of fakes that are out there. Don't trust them. And based on my historical investigation, these ones are authentic. And we have both of these lists. So a lot of these fakes, we only knew of them by name for all these centuries. But with archaeology really picking up in the last 200-300 years, we've actually discovered copies of some of these fakes. So that's what happened with the Gospel of Peter. In 1886, a copy of the Gospel of Peter was found in Egypt. And this copy was dated to the 8th century. So it's an ancient copy. It's an old copy of this, fake, but it's the only copy we have. So consider, as we've discussed, all the thousands of copies that we have of the New Testament books. When it comes to the Gospel of Peter, we only have one copy. One copy of it. And modern scholars agree that it was not written by the Apostle Peter. And it seems these early researchers at these early church councils were familiar with it, even though we haven't had a copy of it for centuries. The early church councils were familiar with it, and they put it in their list of fakes. Okay. All right, the last one we're going to take a look at is the Gospel of Judas. Now, this one is very interesting. So, in AD 180, an early Christian researcher by the name of Irenaeus recorded in his list that this was fake. So we've known about the Gospel of Judas for a long time, but only by name. We've never had a copy of it for a long time in history. It got lost in history. But we knew it by name from, for example, Irenaeus, who said it was a forgery. And by the way, modern scholars agree it's a fake. It wasn't really written by Judas. Very clearly, one of those books written from the Gnostic religion. It's just full of Gnostic teachings, which helps us know, no, this wasn't written by the apostle. It was written by a proponent of Gnosticism. So in the Gospel of Judas, again, they're putting their teaching in the words or in the mouth of Jesus, so to speak. But within the Gospel of Judas, it doesn't include Jesus' public teachings, which could be verified, right? Like the Sermon on the Mount, there were thousands of people there. So Jesus' public teaching is what's recorded in the New Testament, and that can be verified because it was his public teaching, right? It was more public by definition. But the Gospel of Judas contains these supposed private conversations that he only had with Judas. So right there you're, throwing up red flags. Okay, these are just supposed private conversations that only Judas knew about. This wasn't anything he said in public. These are just private. You can just see the conspiracy theorists just salivating over something like this. According then to these private, hidden conversations with Judas, it's explained that Judas wasn't a betrayer of Jesus, but in fact, the only truly good disciple of Jesus. That Jesus and him worked together to protect this hidden knowledge because the other 11 disciples had corrupted it. So you can just, if you know much about Gnosticism, this just screams the Gnostic idea of hidden special knowledge that will save you. And people just love that, right? I mean, we crave tabloids and digging up secrets, and so you can see why something like this would spread around and get popular. But clearly a case of this rival religion of Gnosticism. We only have one surviving copy of it. It was discovered in the 20th century, but it switched hands a lot. Unfortunately, different people got a hold of it and would sell it for money, and people made millions of dollars buying it and selling it. Unfortunately, these things are worth a lot. And so if somebody who doesn't care about history as much, just cares about the money, they don't handle it very well. And unfortunately, even though it's a fake, it's important history. But anyway, through this process, it deteriorated and a lot of it fell apart as it was being bought and sold throughout the 20th century. But you can research more about it now. This one copy that we have is dated anywhere from, they're not sure, sometime in the late, 3rd century, somewhere between 220 and 340. Okay. So if you've read the Dan Brown books, like, what are some of the Da Vinci Code, and some of his other like Indiana Jones fictional books, he uses these to really kind of drum up these conspiracies and make them sound really juicy, and all this speculation about how the councils were trying to suppress women and establish male leadership in the church, and all of these other books that really included Jesus' true teaching that celebrated womanhood were suppressed by the church, and all these conspiracy theories, which makes for a good novel, right? I mean, it's like an Indiana Jones exciting book, or maybe you've seen the movie with Tom Hanks, but there's just no historical background to it at all. I mean, you read some of these fake books, and women can't even go to heaven. So it's not that these fake books were all, pro-women, and the 27 books were in the New Testament are anti-women. In fact, sometimes it's just the opposite. There's one of these fake books where women can't go to heaven, they have to become men first, because only men can go to heaven. So it's such a silly conspiracy to think that that was what motivated these councils to choose one book over another. I mean, it fits into our modern critical theory of oppression, of course, but it's all conspiracy theories. Give me some historical evidence for that. Do you have anything from history that would give evidence that that in fact was the motivation of these folks of choosing these 27 books? Because if you read what they wrote, these early researchers, they clearly state their motivation was to find out what was truly affirmed by the apostles and what wasn't. That was their motivation, according to them. And so it just takes good historical research. I use the example sometimes, it'd be like if I wrote a fake diary of John Wilkes Booth, the guy who assassinated Abraham Lincoln. I could, maybe just for fun, not even to lie on purpose, but just to write a historical fiction as though I was John Wilkes Booth and I wrote a diary about my plot to kill Abraham Lincoln. And then I buried it, or, I died and it was just left in this house for hundreds of years. And then somebody discovered it 1,000 years from now. They might, wonder, was this really written by John Wilkes Booth or not? And they would have to do historical investigation to ascertain that. And that's the same thing that we have to do when it comes to the New Testament. It just takes some historical research, and that's what these early councils were all about. So we've discussed the New Testament so far. Now let's talk about the Old Testament. What books belong in the Old Testament? The question here really is, what was written before Jesus' time that was really a message from God or not? If it was a message from God, it should belong in the Old Testament. If it wasn't a message from God, it shouldn't be in the Old Testament. And again, the main test to know if something is really a message from God or not is miracles. So the miracle test helps us determine what should go in the Old Testament, just like it does the New Testament. Of course, it's always the most ideal when you can witness the miracle with your own eyes, right? I mean, the New Testament writers knew the importance of being an eyewitness. They explained that they were eyewitnesses. So it's always best to be an eyewitness, but it's not necessary. A lot of our beliefs are based on the testimony of others, right? I mean, have you ever seen other planets? Have you been to every, country in the world on a globe? Have you seen all these things with your own eyes? Have you done all the scientific tests that have led you to your scientific beliefs? Well, no, a lot of your beliefs are based on the testimony of others. Geographers, astronomers, scientists. And sometimes those people get it wrong, of course, but you're justified in trusting the testimony of others based on certain qualifications and evidence and so on and so forth. And same thing is true with miracles. We don't have to see it with our own eyes, even though that's ideal. We can base our belief on whether a miracle really happened or not based on good, solid testimony of others. And of course, that's what we have to do with the Old Testament, since it happened so long ago. Since these books were written so long ago, we have to depend on the testimony of others who saw these miracles, even though we didn't with our own eyes. So there's two ways that we can do this, right? The first way is that we can evaluate the evidence for the miracles each person claimed when they claimed they had a new message from God. In other words, we can take all 39 Old Testament books and run them through this miracle test, right? And we can dig through the history, and people do. Some people, that's their full-time job. Their whole career is spent on this sort of Old Testament historical research. But it's more difficult because, we're talking now not 2,000 years, but some things written over 3,000 years ago. So the more time that passes, obviously, the more difficult it is to do that sort of historical investigation. And so we have to rely on the people who were alive at the time, for instance. So you can see in Exodus 4 and in Deuteronomy 18 the miracle test, and the people verifying whether something's really from God or not through this miracle test. This is the test that later Jewish generations used to develop what's called the Hebrew canon. We call it the Old Testament, but the Hebrew canon. This is what later generations used. And again, they had to go back and do, historical investigation as they developed their Jewish Hebrew canon. And here's some things that we do know about this process. So as the Jews tried to develop their canon, their Hebrew canon, tried to determine what books were really from God and which weren't, the Jewish community would argue over some of the, what we call the Old Testament books from time to time. Some of the books in particular they would argue over were Ezekiel, Proverbs, Esther, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Songs, sometimes called Song of Solomon. And when they would argue whether these books are really messages from God or not, the focus of their arguments would be, do we have any evidence that there were miracles associated with the giving of these books? And within the Hebrew Jewish community, that was what was investigated to try to determine their canon. So R.K. Harrison, an Old Testament scholar, he suggests that the Jewish canon probably was completed in the 3rd or 4th century BC. That's when the Hebrew canon really became solidified, kind of like our New Testament canon did at these councils. Because of the historical research and laying down the evidence, you establish what was really approved by the apostles or not, in this case, prophets. And the best evidence indicates that the Jewish community then, when they did this research, settled on the 39 books in our Protestant Old Testament. The order of the books is different and the number of books are different because they combine some of the books together, but it's our 39 Protestant Old Testament books. By the time you get to the year AD 400, so by the time you get to the 5th century, there's no doubt that within the Jewish community, it's the same 39 books that are in our Protestant Bibles. So even within the Jewish community, they've settled on these 39, again, because of the evidence for the miracles associated with them. It's difficult for us nowadays, modern people, to investigate the miracles for the Old Testament books because it's just so far in history, right? So there's another option we can do besides this first option that we've discussed. And the second option is that we can evaluate the evidence for Jesus and his disciples' miracles and then look and see as to what they said were really messages of God given before their time. So what did Jesus and the disciples say about these 39 Old Testament books? So then we're verifying the miracles of Jesus and the disciples, not the Old Testament authors. But if they truly were apostles, prophets, spokesmen for God, then they should have that apostolic authority to be able to say what books in the Old Testament were really from God or not. So I'm going to give you an argument now just using option 2. You can do this research, and there's good Old Testament textbooks, just like I've shared with you some good New Testament textbooks to get you started. But I'm going to give you an argument now based on this second option. Okay? And it's a shorter argument. It goes like this. This is an argument for the Old Testament canon based on the miracles of Jesus and his apostles. So there's good historical evidence for the miracles of Jesus and his apostles. We've looked at this already. We don't have to repeat the work to defend this premise. And this is easier to defend than the Old Testament miracles because it's more recent in history. Premise 2, these miracles then affirm Jesus and the apostles were true prophets. They really had messages from God. They were spokesmen from God, which of course are the books of the New Testament. So we can look at the New Testament books and see what Jesus and the disciples said about the Old Testament books. And we've done some of that work in this class already. And in the New Testament, from Jesus and the disciples, they affirm the Hebrew canon of the Jews of the first century. They affirm that canon, the Jewish canon from the first century, really are messages from God. And they do that in several ways. We looked at some of them. They refer to the Old Testament canon as God's Word. They quote from almost all 39 of the books as God's Word. They name some of the books. Jesus referred to the law, the prophets, and the writings, which was a familiar phrase to refer to the Old Testament canon. So, just to give you one more example of this, Luke 24, verse 44, Jesus uses that phrase, and it was a phrase used in the first century to refer to that Old Testament canon, those 39 books, the law, the prophets, and the writings. Well, there's one last thing we're going to look at in this lecture, and that is the Apocrypha. Now, you might have heard of the Apocrypha before, but let me try to summarize what it is. Protestants call it the Apocrypha, but Catholics usually refer to it as the deuterocanonical, which literally means the second canon. Okay, and that might give you a clue as to why there's controversy here. So this Apocrypha, or deuterocanon, is a collection of writings. Some of them are books. Some of them are just additional chapters to Old Testament books. And they go by different names depending on which Catholic Bible you're looking at. So for example, if you grab a Revised Standard Version of a Catholic Bible, I'm going to keep calling them Apocrypha because that's what we as Protestants call them. The Apocryphal Books are named this, but if you pick up, for instance, a New American Catholic Bible, then they're going to be named this. And I also included here approximately when these different books or chapters were written, and then the last column is whether Catholics accept them as messages from God or not. So even Catholics don't accept all of them as messages from God. They reject some of the Apocrypha. And Protestants reject all of the Apocrypha. Okay? So Protestants would say, including myself, that none of these are truly messages from God. But Catholics would say, no, some of them are really messages from God. So this is the difference between Protestants and Catholics. Now what I want to do, the last thing we'll do here in this lecture, I want to give you the top 10 reasons why Protestants reject all of the Apocryphal books. As you can see, they were written from approximately 300 BC to AD 100. Sometimes this is referred to as the Second Temple period. So they were written during this 400-year period. And the Catholic Church pronounced 12 of the 15 to be messages from God at the Council of Trent in AD 1546. So you might realize what was going on, right, in the 1500s. That was the Protestant Reformation. And it's not a coincidence that it was during the Protestant Reformation, during the 1500s, that the Catholic Church came out and pronounced that these were, in fact, messages from God, because they had not pronounced that before the 1500s. So, I'm going to give you, again, the top 10 reasons why Protestants reject the Apocrypha. First, the majority of major early Christian leaders rejected them. I'm referring to people like Athanasius, Cyril of Jerusalem, Origen, Jerome, who was the most qualified Hebrew scholar of his time. He's the one who translated the Latin Vulgate. He agreed that these were not true messages from God. He said some of them were helpful devotional material, right? You might want to read them for your devotions, just like we read, all sorts of books for devotional inspiration, if you will. But we don't really think, maybe from our pastor, for instance, but we don't think they're messages from God. So a lot of these early church leaders said the same thing, that, yeah, these might be helpful in your spiritual life, devotional life, but they're not really messages from God. More important, though, than early Christian evaluation of these Apocrypha is the Jewish evaluation of them, because they were written within the Jewish community. They were written during the Old Testament era, if you will. And the Jewish community rejected them as being true messages from God. I say the Jewish community were the right ones to ascertain this because it was written within their own community, right? It was written by and in the Jewish community. So they were the one who were best able to examine any evidence for miracles being associated with them. Christians aren't really the best group to figure this out because it wasn't written, it was written before there were any Christians. It was written before the Christian movement. So it's really the Jewish community would be if nothing else, the people in the best position to verify if miracles were performed and these were really messages from God or not. And the Jewish community has rejected them. They did at the time and they still do today. So the Jewish community, their Old Testament, if you will, they don't call it that, of course, but the Jewish 39 books is the same as the Protestant Old Testament, 39 books. The Jews, the Jewish community, are very adamant that prophecy ceased in Israel in about 400 BC, before any of these Apocrypha were written. So I've got several examples of that. The Jewish community, as a whole, agreed that the last prophets were Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. Those are the last prophets. And when they died, the revelation ceased. There have been no new prophets since then, according to the Jewish community. And all of these Apocrypha were written after the prophets died off. Got a historical source for this. You got Josephus, who was a Jewish historian in the 1st century. He excludes the Apocrypha. He said that the Hebrew canon was limited to the same 39 books in our Protestant Old Testament. And Josephus also affirmed, as part of the Jewish community, that prophecy ceased. No miracles, no prophets, no prophecy, no new revelation since 400 BC. With the death of Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, the last prophets. Interestingly enough, St. Augustine, going back to the Christian community, St. Augustine accepted the Apocrypha as messages from God, but he acknowledged that the Jews didn't. Okay, so we have a little bit of enemy attestation there. More important then the fact that the Jews, the Jewish community, rejected the Apocrypha is why they rejected it. And the reason they rejected it is because there's no miracles associated with them. As we've said again and again, that's the key test to know if something is from God or not. And this test is best done by those in the community in which something is written, because they are the ones who are there and can just ask the prophet, hey, we're not sure you really have a message from God. Can you do a miracle to verify? And it's much easier for the immediate community than people 1,500 plus years later, i.e. the Catholic Church during the Reformation, to make this determination. So in the 1500s, the Catholic Church were the wrong people and the wrong time to make this determination. Number 4, the New Testament does not refer to them as God's Word. As we've noted, the New Testament, the apostles and Jesus, they quote all 39 of the Old Testament books as God's Word, the Hebrew canon, but they don't quote any of the Apocrypha. Now, some challenge this. Some Catholics will challenge this and say, no, there are some allusions to the Apocrypha in the New Testament, but I've looked at their reasoning, their arguments, and I'm not convinced. I don't find these allusions to the Apocrypha to be very convincing. Clearly not as explicit as the New Testament authors were about the 39 Old Testament books. I mean, that everybody agrees that is overtly explicit as they quote the Old Testament books. Number 5, it seems that Jesus rejected the Apocrypha. As we noted in Luke 24:44, Jesus refers to the Hebrew canon as the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms. And this is that well-known phrase used to refer to the Hebrew canon of the first century. This phrase was used from the first century all the way up until at least the 10th century to refer to those 39 books. So the best evidence indicates that the Hebrew canon did not include the Apocrypha. Jesus, on 2 occasions, Matthew 23 and Luke 11, said that Zechariah was the last prophet. You remember I said in our vernacular, it would be like saying, all the Old Testament from A to Z. But Jesus said from the blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah, first Old Testament book to the last Old Testament book in his canon. Or the way that the Hebrew canon is organized, which is the same as our Protestant Old Testament canon. So Jesus said the last prophet was Zechariah. Around that 400 BC time period. So Jesus seems to exclude everything written after 400 BC, after Zechariah, which the Apocrypha were. Number 6, I've alluded to this already, but it seems like the Catholic Church accepted these as messages from God more for strategic purposes. Think about what was going on in the 1500s, right? So you've got the Protestant Reformation. You've got Martin Luther and others arguing against indulgences, praying for the dead, arguing against purgatory. And there's a few verses in some of these apocryphal books that seem possibly to support some of these beliefs, indulgences, purgatory, praying for the dead. And so a strategy then of the Catholic Church would be canonizing them would give us more fuel to defend our doctrinal positions against the reformers, against people like Martin Luther and others. And if that was the motivation, or part of the motivation, then that is a terrible, terrible way to decide if something's from God or not. Whether it says something that you like, or whether it says something you want God to say. That's a terrible way to determine what's really from God or not, whether you like it or not, or you want it to be from God or not, right? So if that was at all any part of the motivation, which it seems like it was, just because of the fact of when it happened, when the Catholics canonized these books, then that would lead Protestants to reject it. Interestingly, even some of the Catholic scholars during the Reformation resisted it. So there were Catholic scholars during the 1500s who said, no. These aren't canonical. These aren't really messages from God. And I'll give you an example. The noted Catholic scholar Cardinal Cajetan, I'm not sure if I pronounced it right, C-A-J-E-T-A-N, who opposed Luther, right? He wasn't on the Protestant side. He wasn't for the Reformers. He opposed Luther, but he agreed that the Apocrypha were not really messages from God. And he wrote this in a work of his in AD 1532, a work titled A Commentary on All the Authentic Historical Books of the Old Testament. So not even all Catholics agreed. Catholic scholars, leaders agreed to this. Number 7, although some early Bibles and some Protestant Bibles include the Apocrypha, it was always in a separate section to indicate that they had a different status. And it was always understood that they were not really messages from God. Useful devotional material, kind of like maybe our modern day study Bibles. You might have a John MacArthur study Bible with some notes at the bottom. It might be good for your devotions, but you know John MacArthur's comments aren't from God, right? And it would be similar when the Apocrypha was included in some early Bibles or even some Protestant Bibles. Number 8, none of the Apocrypha books claim to be written by a prophet or claim to be God's Word. In fact, one of them, 1 Maccabees 9:27, refers to a previous time when the prophets ceased to appear. So it seems like even within the Apocrypha, they recognize that there's no prophecy going on anymore. They seem to, just like the Jewish community, understand that prophecy ceased at 400 BC with Zechariah. Compare and contrast this to the 39 Old Testament books that repeatedly claim to be from God, right? You read the Old Testament, it's thus saith the Lord. This is what God said. But the Apocrypha doesn't read like that at all. None of the Apocryphal books include statements like that. All right, number 9. 11 of the 15 Apocryphal books have significant historical inaccuracies. So if we go back to our discussion about inerrancy or even just historical reliability, the Apocrypha books seem to fail in this regard. Tarnishes their credibility, their reliability. For example, Judith 1:5 incorrectly says that Nebuchadnezzar was the king of the Assyrians, which we know from history he was the king of the Babylonians. Baruch 6:2 incorrectly says the Jews would serve in Babylon for 7 generations, when in fact they were there for only 70 years. So just 2 examples. And last, number 10, top 10 reasons the Protestants reject the Apocrypha. There's good evidence that some of them were falsely written, or some of them falsely claim to have been written by well-known people in the Old Testament. So it's kind of like New Testament pseudepigrapha. Nobody's going to accept it if it's written by Adam Johnson. But if I say it was written by the Apostle Peter, well then maybe I can get somebody's attention. Similarly, some of the apocryphal books seem to be of that nature. Not really written by who it claims to be written, but pseudepigrapha, falsely authored, right? And some people would say, well, they weren't trying to deceive people. They were just trying to honor a great Old Testament figure. I'm not so sure. So, for example, Roger Beck has done some work on this and refuted this idea and said, no, here's some evidence that their intent was to deceive the reader, to think it was really written by a famous Old Testament person when in fact it wasn't. So let me close with this. What if I'm wrong? On all the things that we covered tonight, what if I'm wrong? When I say I'm saying we, Protestants, evangelicals, just Christians in general. What if we're wrong on some of the stuff that we covered tonight? For instance, my position is that these 66 books are messages from God. But what if I'm wrong about that? What if we find out, for instance, that the book of Hebrews really wasn't affirmed by the first century apostles? What if we find out that the last part of the Gospel of Mark really wasn't part of the original Gospel of Mark? That in fact happened, right? The last part of Mark, we have found through historical investigation, really wasn't written by Mark and wasn't then therefore approved affirmed as a message from God from the apostles. So the last part of Mark isn't authentic. That actually happened. So what if we discover more of these things? For example, what if we find out that 3 John really wasn't written by John, it really wasn't approved by the apostles? What would happen to our faith? What would happen to our Christianity? Let's talk about the Old Testament. What if I'm wrong about the Apocrypha? Okay, what if Protestants are wrong and no, these in fact are messages from God? In other words, what would be the implications if we're wrong about some of these issues? Well, first of all, I would say with the Apocrypha, I don't think it would be that big of a deal if we made a mistake here. I mean, there are some verses in there that might seem to support a purgatory or praying for the dead, but I've read those verses and I honestly even think that's a stretch, trying to use them to confirm those doctrines. So there's really not much in the Apocrypha that would change our Christian beliefs at all. What about some of these other books? What if we find out that Hebrews really isn't from God? I don't think these things would really alter our faith all that much. It's kind of like when we talked last week about inerrancy. What if I'm wrong in my position on inerrancy? I believe the Bible is completely true and has no mistakes whatsoever. And I think it's these 66 books that are messages from God. But again, what if I'm wrong on either inerrancy or one of or multiple of these 66 books really being from God? I think even if I'm wrong in my position on some of these issues, some of my positions on the Bible being from God or being inerrant, that doesn't necessarily mean that Christianity is false. If you think about it, Christianity is true if God exists and Jesus is God, right? If you've got those two things, that's pretty much Christianity in a nutshell. If there is a God and if Jesus is God, then Christianity is true. Okay? And think about it for a moment. This goes back to the reason why we're doing the class in this order and the reason I am a traditional classical apologist, the reason I make my case for Christianity in this order, is because our belief in the existence of God is based on philosophical and scientific arguments. It's not based on that these 66 books are from God and they're inerrant. We didn't use that at all in establishing the existence of God. So our belief in the existence of God does not depend or is not based on these 66 books being from God or being inerrant. Same thing with the second main belief of Christianity, that Jesus is God. This belief is based on historical evidence that Jesus claimed to be God, that he did miracles, and he rose from the dead. This belief is not based on these 66 books being from God or these 66 books being inerrant. So even if we're wrong on some of these issues about the Bible, this doesn't destroy Christianity. If we find out more of Mark really wasn't affirmed by the apostles, if we find out the book of Hebrews, or if we find out there are some minor mistakes, it doesn't destroy our faith, it doesn't destroy Christianity as a belief system, because the main two beliefs are not based on these other issues. It's not based on these 66 books being from God or them being inerrant. Now, I believe they are, and I've given a defense of my belief of that, but even if I'm wrong here, it doesn't destroy Christianity because these two main beliefs aren't based on that. It doesn't require them. So even if I'm wrong about the Bible, the first two sections of the class, that God exists and Jesus is God, is still true. Our belief in them, we can still make a good case for them, even if we're wrong on some of these issues about the Bible. We don't need the Bible to be from God or inerrant or a perfect canon to make a case for number 1 and number 2 here. So I want to talk about the class schedule just briefly. Remind everybody where we're at. Tonight's April 22nd. We talked about what books should be in the Bible, Lecture 13. You have 2 chapters due read and reading summaries due tonight by midnight. Frank Turek's book, Chapter 14. J.P. Moreland's book, Chapter 10. Next week is going to be April 29th. You have no reading for this week. And I purposely organized it like this so you can start working on your research paper. Several of you have emailed me your ideas, and we're talking about your topics. But go ahead and get to work on them. Maybe these resources I talked about tonight would be helpful to you. If you need any other ideas for resources, let me know. But that will be due on May 6th. So what is that? 2 weeks from tonight, your research paper will be due. That's why I didn't give you any reading. Also on May 6th, I'll be emailing you, your final exam, and then that will be due back to me on May 13th via email. So there's no class on May 13th. The last class is May 6th, but on the 6th, you'll get your final via email, and then you'll have a week to complete it. And there is a bit of reading that last week as well. I apologize, but we had to slip it in somewhere. As always, if you have questions about the class, logistics, or the content, please let me know. I'm here to help.